Welcome everyone to Learn at Lunchtime. So glad you could join us today. I am Sherry Trimble, one of the museum educators at the State Museum of Pennsylvania. Let me bring in my fellow museum educator, Beth Erickson, and I'm going to turn it over to her.
Thank you, Sherry. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I am Beth Erickson, museum educator at the State Museum of Pennsylvania, and this is Adventures in Nature Lab. Our topic today is butterflies and moths of Pennsylvania. And with us is Betsy Leppo, who has worked with the Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Program for over 25 years. Betsy conducts surveys for terrestrial and aquatic invertebrates, maintains in-house specimen collections and databases, and develops conservation recommendations for species and habitats. Recently, Betsy has been working on research in support of status assessment and conservation activities for two globally rare pollinators, the frosted elfin and the Appalachian grizzled skipper, two of Pennsylvania's rarest butterfly species, which have been identified as species of greatest conservation need at both the state and regional level. Hello, Betsy. Thank you for joining us for a conversation today.
Hi, Beth. Thank you for having me.
So tell us a little bit about the Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Program and the Western PA Conservancy and what you do there.
The Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Program, it's a partnership between several state agencies, including the Pennsylvania Department of Natural Resources, the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission, the Pennsylvania Game Commission, and then the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy. We're the nonprofit in this crowd, and we also work in cooperation with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And, we really work on gathering information on rare plants and animals, important ecological communities, even geologic features. And our goal is to just gather objective, reliable ecological data to guide conservation and land use planning.
That's great that so many agencies are able to work together and combine all that information to help to take care of all the plants and animals throughout Pennsylvania. That's fantastic. Let's start with a basic question about today's topic for you. So when we talk about insects such as butterflies and moths, why are they important?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start my slides if that's all right, and
that's
we'll
perfect.
get right into that.
Okay.
I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Yeah, so Beth already mentioned some of the things that I work on. But just for a full disclaimer, I'm not a taxonomic expert on any particular group of insects, but I do get to work with some great experts. And I would just like to take a moment here. I'm going to share some really nice pictures. And I'd like to thank all the people who contributed some photos to this presentation, and in particular, Pete Woods, a colleague of mine who's really been working on learning the moths and photographing them, and it takes a lot of patience. So to get to Beth's question, what is the importance of insects, pollinators? Well, there's a lot of positive values of native insects. They're an essential part of our balanced ecosystem, from pollination to dung burial, which maybe you've never really thought about, but it's actually worth an estimated $380 million annually in the United States.
Well, it's got to go somewhere, right?
It does. Somebody's got to do something with it. Nutrient cycling, food for wildlife. There's really interesting and important insect-plant interactions, such as herbivory and chemical defense. There's insect-to-insect interactions, such as pest control through natural predators and parasitoids. And really, just insects are such a diverse group with such unique biologies. They're just really important for discoveries and research in medicine and agriculture, industry, all sorts of different fields, and they can help us solve some tough problems. So I guess to get us in the right frame of mind here of what we're talking about, I'm focusing on butterflies and moths for this presentation. And I saw this sarcastic answer to this question on Quora, and it just inspired me to make my own version. So butterflies, they're beautiful, right? And they're peaceful. They pollinate flowers because they want to help the world. They steer clear of light bulbs. They're friendly. They're charming. They're respectful of clothing, and they treat everybody with fairness and respect. For moths, oh, they're dull and dingy. They're grumpy, disagreeable. They only pollinate if they get paid good money. They bomb recklessly into light bulbs. They're sullen and self-loathing. They eat your clothing, and they bully smaller insects. So I don't know why these stereotypes got so ingrained in history between why moths are active at night. They can be destructive of certain things, crops, and even your clothing. But really, the majority of them are really wonderful creatures that do the same sorts of pollinating activities that butterflies do. So in this slide, you'll see that I actually, if you were paying attention, the butterfly is actually the dull brown plain one on the top left. That's a dusky wing. And the moth is the gaudy, brightly marked one on the right. Butterflies actually have fairly modest diversity in Pennsylvania. We have 6 families and 155 species documented in our state, where the moths is a much broader, bigger group with 61 families and 2,052 species in Pennsylvania. And that number is growing as we study them more. And just given their greater diversity and the sheer numbers of moths, they really do accomplish more pollination than their daytime counterparts. Oops, zoom. But both of them spend most of their time searching, looking for food to eat, finding a mate, finding the right plants where they should lay their eggs so their young have the right food to eat, and avoiding predators. There are some physical differences you can look at. Butterflies tend to be more slender. They do tend to be more brightly colored. The antennae are pretty helpful. Butterflies, there on the bottom left, have a thin antennae with a little knob at the end. Skippers are a type of butterfly, but they're unique in that their antennae end with a little hook. And then moth antennae tend to be comb-like or feathery. They can have thin filamentous antennae like butterflies, but they won't have that knob on the end. Another difference is that is in when they pupate. Now, moths and butterflies, they both undergo complete metamorphosis, going through 4 life stages: egg, caterpillar, pupa, and winged adult. But when they pupate, the butterflies will make a chrysalis, which is basically just a hard exoskeleton covering that protects the developing butterfly. The moth will create a cocoon, which they spin out of silk, or they fasten plant matter around themselves, and they pupate inside this protective kind of sleeping bag. But there's some moths that actually skip the cocoon, and they'll just pupate in a little chamber that they dig in the soil. And basically they have a chrysalis. It's just hidden either in a chamber in the ground or in that cocoon. So here's some pictures that show representatives of each of the 6 butterflies in Pennsylvania, from the iconic swallowtail butterfly there at the top right. That's a spicebush swallowtail, down to the little the skippers. And at the bottom right there, we have a little Delaware skipper who's spreading his wings skipper style. So that's our representatives of our 6 butterfly families.
As you're showing that, I think skippers are the ones I most commonly see in my yard. And I'm guessing it probably depends on what I have planted there.
Yeah, skippers are very common and abundant, and you'll see them flittering around your garden. Now, we don't have time to investigate all 61 moth families, so I identified the 6 most species-rich families of moths to illustrate here. And half of these family groups are micromoths. They're at the top 3. We have the pyralids, the crambids, and the tortricids. These are smaller moths with wingspans generally less than 3/4 of an inch. And they include things like stem borers, root borers, leaf rollers, and leaf miners in the caterpillar stage. And then the bottom 3, there are sort of our typical major macromoth families. The tiger moths, the tussock moths, the owlet moths, the geometrid moths. And just to highlight the most species-rich moth family, this number grid helps you visualize the number of owlet moths in Pennsylvania. We have 486 different species known at present. And the pictures just show the variability of moths within this group, We have things like the silver-spotted fern moth at the left there, the beautiful wood nymph on the right, whose appearance is actually intended to mimic bird droppings to help camouflage it. And at the bottom is the unmarked dagger moth, which is a typical representative of the genus Acronicta, which we have 45 different species of Acronicta in Pennsylvania. And I'll just show a few more photos that highlight the wild diversity of moths in Pennsylvania, just to give you a sense of their beauty and uniqueness. Here we have a clearwing moth, the Virginia creeper clearwing moth. Here is the orange stripe-backed moth in the twirler family.
It's amazing. Some of these I would not even identify. Like if I saw it, I would not know it was a moth. I would think it was a different insect.
Yeah, and these feathery wings are just fabulous, just little
Oh,
skinny
beautiful.
feathery wings. This is a leaf blotch miner in the leaf blotch miner family.
For a lot of these is the appearance to act as camouflage to help it to protect it.
Yes, that's definitely a big part behind why you know, the patterns and the colors, even of many butterflies, they may even look more bright to us than they would actually appear to predators, because a lot of these spots and patterns help break up their outline and make them blend in with their surroundings. Now this guy, I don't know what it's camouflaged to, but you'll even see these colors if you think about the colors of maple seeds, or you know, these colors do exist in nature, and um, sometimes bright colors are a warning sign too, like with the monarch kind of classic example. Those bright colors are a warning that it's actually distasteful to eat. And this is our beautiful rosy maple moth, one of our royal moths. And here's one of just the giant silk moths, the
Oh,
Cecropia moth.
wow.
So this you would need two hands to, you know, capture it, the full breadth of its wingspan.
That's amazing.
So these tables just give the number of moth and butterfly species in Pennsylvania and their conservation status at the state and global level. A global rank of G4 or G5, that just means the species is secure across its entire range. And a state rank of S4 or S5 means that the species is also secure in Pennsylvania. At the state level, 7% of our moths and 37% of our butterflies are rare, which I'm defining here as anywhere from presumably extinct to possibly extinct to critically imperiled or imperiled to vulnerable in the state. And at the global level, those numbers are a little lower. It's 2% of our moths and about 7% of our butterflies are rare. Um, we do have some globally rare species in Pennsylvania, and they tend to have one or more of these qualities. They have a limited global range, specialized habitats, specialized caterpillar food plants, a limited ability to disperse or colonize new habitats, and lower reproductive or recruitment rates. So I'll show you a few examples that Beth mentioned in the introduction. We've been looking at a couple of these globally rare butterflies over the past few years. The first is the grizzled skipper.
It's beautiful.
Yes, it's small, but when you get that up close look at it and you see those neat patterns on them, they really are pretty. This butterfly occurred in just 10 states in the northeastern United States. That's it. That's all the further you would find this species. And the caterpillars feed on dwarf cinquefoil, which is a delicate, low-growing plant in the rose family. The butterfly is a specialist on this plant in Pennsylvania, but the food plant is found commonly in many places where the butterfly is not. So habitat really is a key feature in figuring out where Appalachian grizzled skippers occur. They are or were found in barrens, open woodlands, old pastures, and power lines that are located on eroding shale slopes and in trap rock glades. And these habitats also have to have a suitable mix of other plants like warm season bunch grasses, early spring blooming wildflowers, and are typically surrounded by an open oak pine woodland that's not been sprayed for gypsy moths.
So you need a host plant for the young and then other plants for the adults.
Yes, yes, they like these plants here are some examples of what the adults like to nectar on, but the caterpillars will only eat that cinquefoil. So historically, the Appalachian grizzled skipper was found in 9 counties in south central and southeastern Pennsylvania. And in the past 30 years, those dwindled to one population in Huntingdon County. And now that population is presumed extirpated or extinct from Pennsylvania. The other globally rare butterfly I'd like to highlight is the frosted elfin. This is another little tiny butterfly, but again, when you look at it closely, it has this really lovely frosting color on the bottom edge of the hind wing.
It's almost like it's been dipped in a little bit of silver.
Yes, yes, it's really adorable. Globally, the frosted elfin skipper occurs only in the eastern half of the United States. And in this picture here, the red states indicate where the species is critically imperiled to imperiled. And throughout its range, the caterpillars will feed on yellow wild indigo and or wild lupin. Both are members of the legume or pea family. The caterpillars seem to specialize on yellow wild indigo in Pennsylvania. And yellow wild indigo is not considered a rare plant in Pennsylvania, but it is hard to find large patches of it. And here's an example of frosted elfin habitat in Pennsylvania. And there's not been active management at this was really the only known site for a while, and there hadn't been any active management. So succession was slowly changing the habitat and shading out their host plant. So even though they've been hanging on here, the habitat is changing, and sometimes active management is needed to keep it open enough for the butterfly and its host plant. And then here's another a site that we learned about more recently. It's a 100-foot wide pipeline that's mowed about every 3 years. And this site has the biggest concentration of wild indigo I've ever seen. You can actually see the mounded shape of the wild indigo plants and the prolific yellow blooms sort of everywhere you look here. So
Betsy, where is that located?
this is in Huntingdon County.
Okay.
So they're the two populations that we know about now. I mean, it used to be, the species used to be found in 20 counties in Pennsylvania. And for decades, the only known population was in Center County. But in 2016, that new population was found in Huntingdon County by John and Becky Peplinski, who are two local naturalists who just, they enjoy spending their free time out hiking and photographing birds and insects and other wildlife. And they just stumbled across this butterfly and realized what it was. So hopefully other small populations persist that we just haven't found yet. And another factor that might contribute to the rarity of this particular species is its relationship to ants. And actually, a number of butterflies in this same family, the Lysanidae family, their caterpillars are often tended by ants who protect them from predators in exchange for a honeydew that the caterpillars excrete. So it just brings in a whole bunch of new questions about how to protect the species or to help it. Do we also need to be managing habitats for the ants? How important are they to the success of the frosted elfin caterpillars? Where are the ant colonies located, and what do the ants need in their habitat in order to do well? So that's actually an ant with its sort of in its protective stance here around the frosted elfin caterpillar.
So it's a good example of needing to know the entire story, not just solving a problem that you see, but making sure that you know all of what the animal would need, or in this case, the frosted elfin would need in order to continue to survive in a habitat.
Yes, and there's many questions that we still need to answer, like which species of ants are tending these caterpillars, where we have them. And are they a limiting factor to how well the frosted elfin is doing across its range? So I mentioned some life history characteristics that are associated with rarity at the global level, and these same characteristics are often associated with species that are considered rare in Pennsylvania when evaluated at the state level. And then there are also many human-caused stressors that tend to hit those same global and state rare species the hardest because they're already naturally limited in where they can occur. So this graph just lists some common stressors in no particular order from habitat loss and fragmentation to invasive plants to climate change. And the ascending steps and intensifying colors just are to evoke that sense of the cumulative impacts of multiple stressors. And populations become increasingly isolated and reduced over time. And as local populations wink out, the species as a whole may collapse and be unable to recover. So I want to talk a little bit about, what can we do to help pollinators? Even if you don't have a globally rare butterfly or moth living in your backyard, there are many things you can do to help pollinators. You can, create habitat, around your home and in the community. You can learn about the plants and animals that you encounter and what plants and habitats they need. You can participate in citizen science projects to document where things are found and support organizations that work to protect wildlife and habitats. Just to elaborate a little more on volunteerism, there's many parks and forests that need help with invasive plant control, habitat management, education, outreach, and documenting the plants and wildlife in those parks. So you might look into helping out with your local state park or forest friends group, where you can enroll in something like one of the Penn Station Extension programs like Master Gardeners, Master Naturalist, Master Watershed Program, or Forest Stewards. And the citizen science is a really neat component. I was talking earlier about the globally rare frosted elfin and how that new population was discovered by citizen scientists. And now we are actively working with the land manager of that site to improve the habitat for the butterfly there. And there's more work that needs to be done. We need more eyes on the ground, looking for good patches of caterpillar food plant, the yellow wild indigo. And photos of this plant can be easily posted through an app like iNaturalist, where folks like myself in the Heritage Program can look at them. Now, if you want to create habitat for pollinating insects, where should you do it? Well, it really can be anywhere that you have access and a sense of connection. It can be at your home, in your backyard and garden, and planters on your deck. It can also be where you go to school or where you work. Being, a worker or a student there, you really have the best chance of finding and developing opportunities to create some pollinator habitat. That could even be, like on your school campus or your workplace. And it can be anywhere, even where your family likes to go outdoors, in parks, even cemeteries. I've seen some beautiful cemeteries where, like this top right picture, this majestic beach that was in the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in New York, and some really beautiful plantings there. Things can be really just, pollinator habitat can really be tucked in just about anywhere. And if you're a farmer, you can, build pollinator habitat around agricultural areas, which will, also benefit the crops in terms of pest control and pollination services.
It's a really good tie-in with our conversation we had last month with Andrew Rohrbaugh about native plants and the idea of really doing research about what you're putting in the ground where you are, not just. So I'm thinking of the thinking of the plant and being specific as far as putting the native plant in order to encourage the native animal rather than just putting in a plant because of its beauty.
Yes, exactly. And I'm putting in a shout out right here because I watched Andrew's presentation and it was really great. He really hit the highlights. And so I just recommend people to look up. That was from the presentation he gave it on May 14th. And
Well, I'll tell you,
great.
I went after that program and sunk quite a bit of money in buying native plants and filling in my garden. So I'm super excited to see what's going to happen this summer and how it's going to change what insects and other animals are going to come visit based on Andrew's recommendations. So, and now combining that with your recommendations, I'm really going to look for making a place for butterflies and moths in my personal space. So,
Yeah, it can become quite a undertaking, a bit of an obsession, but it really is rewarding when you start to see plants and insects in your yard that you didn't have before.
yeah, he had mentioned as you were saying that he kept saying, I'm not an entomologist. I'm not an entomologist, but just in general, just having that understanding of, and your slide that just popped up of native, like that concept of really thinking native, not just what's available at the garden center, what's a good deal, but thinking of native to combine the plantings for the animals.
Yeah, Andrew did a great job, covering planting recommendations, with that in mind. I'm just going to focus a little more on like some of these more specific connections between insects and birds and some underappreciated food plants that you may already have. You just don't appreciate that they're already doing something for the pollinators in your yard. Um, really at the heart of it, you do want to build up that variety of native plants because over 90% of our moth and butterfly caterpillars, they specialize on only one or a small group of native plants, like monarch caterpillars need milkweed. And furthermore, 96% of terrestrial birds rear their young on insects, and most bird populations are limited by the amount of food they can find. So uh, Dr. Douglas Talmy at the University of Delaware has done a variety of research with his students there on the relationships between native and invasive plants, insects, and birds. And from his research and literature reviews, he's found these, come up with these figures that are really helpful. And in one of his studies, he found that native plants produce 35 times more caterpillar biomass, that's moths, butterflies, and sawfly caterpillars, than exotic plants will produce. So natives really are best both for bugs and birds. And just
I
to
will say, I think that's a good point too, that we think about butterflies and they're beautiful, but really there is a food web. There's animals that need to eat other animals. So as much as we want to encourage the caterpillars to grow and become adults, in the same sense, those caterpillars, the part of the purpose of them is to provide food for birds that are not the seed eating birds. So that they're out there to be consumed, whether we want them to or not.
Yep, that's the energy, the movement of the nutrients and the energy through the food chain, going from the plants to the primary consumers to the, just on up to our little insectivorous birds here, like this little Carolina chickadee. Another neat study that I read about from Dr. Talmy, they studied the reproduction and survival of Carolina chickadees within residential yards. Now, just to put things in perspective, during the breeding season, Carolina chickadees, along with 96% of all those other terrestrial birds, they need a lot of insects to feed their young. And in the case of chickadees, they need more than 5,000 insects per clutch of hatchlings. And that's mostly caterpillars that they're feeding. They need that to feed their young just to rear one clutch. So in this study, they found that when non-native plants increased in these neighborhoods, the insect availability and chickadee populations both declined. So chickadee populations, they could only really be sustained if non-native plants made up less than 30% of the total biomass, plant biomass within their home ranges. So that's pretty significant. They really have to work so hard. The more non-natives are, the harder the birds have to work to try and find enough caterpillars for their young. And just, he also makes the point that given that 80% of the land, in the United States, and this is specifically the 48 contiguous states, it's privately managed land. So future conservation efforts, they need to really include private lands, and what's going on there.
So, and that's specific to even our small backyard plots as far as our private management, us really thinking as humans what our impact is on the environment and down to the insects that are on our plants.
Yeah, absolutely. It really has to be done on the small scale and then replicated over and over and over. And I'm not going to drone too long on these invasives, but there's a really nice list that I'm going to give you a link to that DCNR has of the worst offenders for invasive plants that have a really bad tendency to spread prolifically, outside of where they originally were planted. So these are things you really want to avoid, and if you already have them in your yard, they would be priorities for eradication. And, a plant that has fed nothing has not done its job. So, if you have a whole property full of pest-free plants, then there's no animals, pest or otherwise, that are going to be nourished by those plants. And, insect nibbled plants are actually a good thing. So, typical herbivory by native insects, it's not going to kill a plant. It just might make it look a little less than perfect. And you will come to appreciate all the chewing and mining and sucking and grinding and gall building and leaf rolling. These are signs that your plants are functioning properly as a home for many insects. And, caterpillar aggregations are often a good thing. It's not necessarily a sign that something's going wrong. So if you provide the host plants, they will come. And here's just a few insect congregations you might find enjoying your backyard banquet. So like if you plant pipevine and I don't know how to say it, Aristolochia species, you might get pipevine swallowtails. And you'll often find many caterpillars feeding gregariously like this. If you live in a place with dry sandy soils and you have scrub oak, like up in the northeast part of the state, there's a lot of this kind of habitat. You might get Barron's buck moths. And they also, especially in younger stages, feed gregariously like this, that big mass of caterpillars. But don't touch these guys. They are one of the few caterpillars that really can sting you with
Oh,
their
wow.
spines. And most people will get tent caterpillars in their yard, whether they want to or not. The eastern tent caterpillar moth, it is a native species in Pennsylvania, and their silken nests are visible on cherries in the spring. They tend to have periodic outbreaks, which can cause unsightly defoliation of the trees that they favor, but they don't generally kill their host trees, which will produce a second set of leaves after the caterpillars complete their life cycle. So some people might see a nest overflowing with mature caterpillars like that photo on the right and really, want to set fire to it. But um, if you look a little closer, now there's a bird that really loves those things, and that's the yellow-billed cuckoo. They're among the few bird species who really like to eat hairy caterpillars. They're secretive, they're seldom seen, but they're not uncommon. They're in woodlands throughout Pennsylvania, and they can eat large numbers of tent caterpillars, as many as 100 in one sitting. And what's really cool is that as they eat these hairy caterpillars, the spines accumulate in the lining of their stomach. And then periodically, to get rid of those spines, they shed their stomach lining and they'll cough it up and spit it out, kind of like an owl spits out its pellet. So they really love the tent caterpillars. Here's a really
That is the cool fact for the day. I have never heard that before. That's amazing.
yeah, they're cool. And here's another really important sort of what we would say pest, the eastern spruce budworm. They're a significant pest in conifer forests, especially to the north. Spruce budworm caterpillars feed on the buds and needles of firs and spruces. Now, actually, under normal conditions, populations of this insect are low and they can be hard to find. They're a native species, but periodically they undergo a population outbreak and they can become so abundant that they can cause serious feeding damage. But evening grosbeaks, pictured here, and other boreal birds, they really depend on spruce budworms to feed their young. And in 2020, there was an outbreak of spruce budworms that boosted evening grosbeak and other northern finch populations. Think redpolls, grosbeaks, pine siskins, crossbills, purple finches. They provided so much food that there was really great nestling success and it supported second broods. And on top of that, the pesticide spraying programs that would typically have been conducted to control the outbreak were limited due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So during last year's breeding season, these birds had full access to the spruce worm banquet, and there was a finch superflight the following winter, this past winter, as a bumper crop of northern finches moved south in search of enough winter forage. So that was one spot of good news for an otherwise dismal situation for boreal birds. Since 1970, an estimated 500 million, or 33% of boreal forest bird population has been lost. And evening grosbeaks have been particularly hard hit, as the most steeply declining land bird, with 9 out of 10 evening grosbeaks gone. This is since the 1970s. So there's a really neat presentation. I have just another shout out. David Yaney, colleague at the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy, did on February 19th, and you can find that on the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy's YouTube channel about the finch superflight and research that they're doing on the evening grosbeak.
That's really great. We did a program earlier in, I believe, February or March, I think, on birds in Pennsylvania, specifically feeding during the early spring. So to kind of tie all that into, again, what impact we as humans can have by stopping things we see as problems. So, we're spraying where we think there's a problem, but when we stop doing that, we're increasing a food source for another animal and helping that population. So seems like humans are a big problem throughout a lot of this. So
yeah, it's hard, when you have, the timber value is can be decreased. The spruce budworms, if they're bad for enough years, they don't typically kill spruce trees in just 1 year, but if the population, the outbreak continues for several years, you can start to lose trees, or at nothing, it can make them just grow slower. So yeah, it's that economic loss that, that obviously
understood. Yeah.
spurs the spraying. But yeah, it was just sort of crazy, like just because of the pandemic, we got to see what it looks like when it doesn't get sprayed
Yeah.
for the birds. And this is just a table to again highlight some things that may already be in your yard or in the area that are really great pollinator resources, but you don't think of them maybe as such because they're trees or shrubs, and they some of them don't even flower with like your typical pollinator flower. So but they provide for a lot of caterpillars. So this is from Douglas Tallamy's book, Bringing Nature Home. It just picked out the top tree and shrub species that support over 200 unique species of Lepidoptera, and that's per group. So oaks there, they support 534, different kinds of moths and butterflies. And so some of these things, you may already have, and they're already serving a great function in your yard for pollinators. So I'm just going to show you some things that feed on some of those plants. For oak feeders, here's our buck moth again. I just had to show this one again because it's such a pretty moth. This is a day-flying moth that you see in the fall. That's why they call it the buck moth. It tends to fly when the bucks are in rut. We have even prickly things like pines and cedars are good food plants for things like juniper hair streaks and pine devils. The leaves don't even need to be attached to a tree to make food. These are caterpillars that feed on decomposing leaves. So another reason to, mulch gardens with the leaves from your trees. And we have heath feeders. I think heaths are often overlooked, things like huckleberries, blueberries, deerberries. These are beautiful shrubs with leaves that nourish caterpillars and flowers that feed adults as well. And even lichens feed caterpillars. Here's one of our lichen moths. And just a quick note on long distant migrants. They must cover long distances, so every backyard has a role to play. There's some abundant weedy native plants that are particularly important because they are prolific and can grow under less than ideal conditions. So things like white snakeroot and goldenrod. So if you can, if you can just leave them in places in your yard where you can tolerate them, they're great just to leave them there. And if you have room for dense plantings of nectar favorites like this wild bergamot, you really will attract many insects on their journeys and support local pollinators as well. So I see that I'm starting to get kind of short on time here. We have about
you're
5
good.
more
You're good.
minutes.
Yeah.
The last sort of section here, I'm just going to sort of fly through these, but I just want to show you some pictures of some great pollinator habitats in natural areas and some of the butterflies you might find there. And, this summer, as you explore nearby natural areas, think about the habitats you see. Look at what plants are growing in the shady woodlands there, in the wet and dry meadows, in the woodland glades, and on the stream floodplains. And you can use natural areas as an inspiration for the plants and habitats you want to develop on your property. You can use apps like iNaturalist to document what you find and contribute through citizen science. And then, go and buy these plants from native plant nurseries or transplant them from within your own yard or swap with friends and family, but just please don't take them from public lands. Leave them there. So here's lake shores where you might find red admiral butterflies whose caterpillars use nettles. That's beautiful mountain laurel in bloom there. We just had that blooming a few weeks ago around here.
Yeah.
Stream sides, sunny meadows located beside streams are a really important part of floodplain systems. They provide nesting sites for turtles, snakes, and birds. They're a good place for foraging bats and birds and dragonflies and pollinators. So not every inch of stream bank needs to be planted in trees. If what is growing there is a mix of native plants, grasses, and shrubs, it's really going to do a fine job of protecting the stream bank, but also providing this sort of important resource. Shrublands and barrens support some really interesting and unique assemblages of birds, plants, and insects. I just love woodland glades. I have a bunch of there's just so many different kinds and flavors of them, depending on what kind of soil and bedrock they're over. Here's a little glade with bird's foot violet and creeping phlox at a grizzled skipper site that I visited this spring in West Virginia. Here's a little glade where I found northern metal marks whose caterpillars feed on roundleaf ragwort. And the adults really love woodland sunflowers. Here's a small meadow at Gifford Pinchot State Park where juniper hair streaks and zebra swallowtails come to nectar. And their caterpillar host plants, eastern red cedar and pawpaw, they're found in the adjacent borders and woodlands. And oak and pine woodlands with sunny exposed soils are great habitats for those things that need sandy, well-drained soils, like this pine elfin, whose caterpillars feed on pines. Even power line right-of-ways, especially if they have a lot of native vegetation, like those huckleberries and blueberries we were talking about growing along the edges, they can be great pollinator habitat. And pipelines, same sort of thing. As long as the invasives aren't too bad and you have a lot of native vegetation, they can be really, really great pollinator habitats. Roadsides, especially like through forest areas, can be habitat for little skippers that feed on grasses. A lot of times little glades habitats do occur along roadsides. Here's the silvery blue butterfly that feeds on Carolina vetch growing along a roadside. Woodlands themselves host so many different butterflies and moths. Here's the hackberry emperor whose caterpillars feed on hackberry trees. We have our woodlands and upland fields. Of course, the monarch, that's upland fields is where you'll find your milkweeds, especially if they're mowed in like the fall and winter outside of the growing season. That's a great time to mow a field, to leave the flowers there in the summer and the spring, summer and fall, and then mow after that first frost is a great time to mow and keep it open. And wet meadows are really lovely pollinator habitats with violets and flat top white aster being two host plants here that support some neat butterflies. Sedge wetlands. Sedges support lots and lots of cool butterflies like this eyed brown and this two-spotted skipper on the bottom left. And they also, wet meadows and bogs with cranberry will support the rare bog copper, whose caterpillars feed on cranberries. So that's it. I am going to leave you with some resources that you can come back to the presentation later and in the recording and look at these, and they'll also be sent out, I think, in a follow-up email. So I'm just going to kind of cruise through these since we're.
Yeah, we'll pop that in the email when I send out the recording, so you don't have to worry about trying to get those.
Okay. Yep. So just Doug Tallamy's books are great. Either Bringing Nature Home, or I actually haven't looked at this one yet. Nature's Best Hope looks like a really great book about working in your yard, for pollinator conservation and other wildlife. And if you're interested, I do have a habitat management for pollinators document that I'd be happy to share. You can email me for a copy of that. And a few more pollinator resources, a little bit of information about using Seek or iNaturalist.
Oh, that's perfect. That answers a question one of our listeners had. They said, is there a good app to identify butterflies and moths? So
Yes, I highly recommend Seek or iNaturalist, and you can look at these a little bit more. If you look at the Seek user guide, it'll kind of tell you what it's intended for. They're both by um, the same platform, but iNaturalist is sort of the fuller app where you can get help with identification. You can also post your observations so that others can see them. And so thank you, Beth and Cherry and the State Museum of Pennsylvania.
well, we're not going to let you go just quite yet. We have a few questions. And the first question I'm going to share with you is from one of our listeners who had emailed earlier. She's anxious to get an answer to this question. So she's about to go on vacation to Cowan's Gap, the Appalachians in the south of the state, for a week. She's looking for the Appalachian azure, but worried she might not be able to identify it if she sees it. So she's looking for tips for identification for that butterfly or other butterflies to watch out for the area.
Yeah, that
would that be one to use the app again?
Absolutely. Like, take pictures, and that one can definitely be identified from a photograph. Especially try to get a picture of the underside of the wing. It is sort of a larger blue, so relatively speaking, compared to some of the other little blue butterflies you might see. You want to be keeping your eyes open for its host plant, which is black cohosh. And if you're around the host plant, you might get to see the butterflies coming in to lay their eggs there, or even look for signs of caterpillars feeding on the plant. So yeah, it's just take pictures, put them on iNaturalist, and there's a whole team of there's like a built-in sort of recognition software that will help identify your stuff, and then there's also just a whole community of other naturalists who will help identify your things.
That's great. Well, here's another one, and I told you I would not throw you any outliers, but this might be it. So we'll see what we can do. Question regarding tent caterpillars. There were several questions, so I'm going to go down to the last part of it. Are tent caterpillars the same as bagworms? And if so, should they be left alone?
Bagworms are a different critter.
Okay.
So they don't make like a big nest. They're more like in their own personal little, almost like they kind of carry like a hermit crab or something. They kind of carry their own bag with them. So you might see a whole bunch of them, but they'll be individuals. And yeah, so I don't know if there's how many kinds of bagworms there are. So I'd have to get back to you for specifics on if there's native versus non-native ones.
So this could even be something to maybe use iNaturalist and go on and see to identify what's out there that might be on there as well.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, there's quite a lot of insects to you can't know everything, right?
Right.
Another question was, someone is interested in starting a habitat on their property. And we had this question with Andrew as well. Do you have any recommendations where they can get plants? Are there local sources that we know of that can provide natives?
Yeah, I think like if you visit the Native Plant Society website, they usually will post native plant sales going on in the area, and you can look for one that's closest to you. They're becoming more and more common. Like there seems to be a healthy number of native plant sales now. They tend to be in the spring, but there's also some places will do them also in the fall. The fall is a great time to plant natives as well, because you're like kind of coming into the cooler weather and you won't have to water as much. You might have to have a little delayed gratification to watch them, the next year. But yeah, there's also some of the native plant nurseries, you have to buy in bulk. So they don't all do like retail, but some local nurseries around Harrisburg area have been, increasing their native plant offerings. But like Andrew mentioned in his presentation, you just want to have your phone with you, and when you see the name of the plant, like type it in and make sure it's, it is legitimately a native plant.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And that leads to another question that we had. A person frequently worries about non-native plants such as borage, bachelor buttons, pincushion flower, bees friends, and others, which seem to be highly attractive to natives, but might not be good for them nutritionally. Is there a nutrition concern, or is nectar?
Yeah, there's definitely different, not all nectar's created equal. There's also the pollen itself. If for bees, the quality of the pollen is another important thing. You have to sort of trust that the insects themselves will hunt out what they need. Um, so, but you want to try to offer more native things because those will tend to be offering them what they do need. But I don't stress too much, if you have some non-aggressive, non-natives that you just really love, as long as they don't have that reputation of spreading aggressively, outside of your garden, then I wouldn't stress about it too much.
Another listener said they spotted their first yellow-billed cuckoo last week in mountain ash trees in their backyard and watched it for an hour.
Oh,
So
wow, that's so cool.
that's really neat. Now I want to think about that one as far as what do I need to have in order to make that happen for myself. And then this is okay. I've got another one of those outlier questions. Do you know if beetles are still used to dye or decorate clothing?
I think so. I mean, I don't know if it's like commonly used. I don't know how important they are in the industry anymore, but I know they at one point they were, and I think they still are used. But yeah, I can't speak any more to it than that.
That's fine. I always say that now I challenge that person to go out and Google it and send us the information. So that's great. Betsy, thank you so much for joining us today for this conversation and for sharing this valuable information about the butterflies and moths in Pennsylvania, and especially the ecological importance of these rare species. I thank you for being with us.
Well, great. It's been really fun, and I appreciate everybody who joined and participated in this.
And just to remind everybody, you will be receiving all the links that Betsy had out there. Quite a lot of resources that are available for you. So Sherry's going to put those in the chat box for now, and we will send them along with the recording of the program. So this is Jeff Smith, and he's going to talk to us about fishes of the Susquehanna River, give us a little history of the river itself. And again, we're really doing a lot of focusing on ecological impact and where we humans kind of fit in with the whole local habitats and what differences we make. So he'll talk to us a little bit about that. Also coming up in June, we have some other conversations with other Learn at Lunchtime times.
Yep.
So please go
Next
online.
week's going to be about the colored troops returning from the Civil War, and the celebration will be in celebration of Juneteenth. So I'm looking forward to next week's on the Pennsylvania Grand Review.
And if you are a member of the State Museum of Pennsylvania, please sign up for the June 25th Walks with Walter, and also check out your emails and the webpage. We have some member-only events coming up that involve Walter Mashaka, our senior curator of zoology and botany. So that'll be great. So thank you everybody for attending today. We appreciate that. And again, thank you, Betsy, and everybody have a great rest of your day.